Good morning, everybody, and welcome to an in-person panel. I think one of the first we've done basically since March last year. And really, we're going to talk about today, is the UK trade digitalisation moving fast enough to remain competitive? So I've got a very distinguished panel with me here in person today and one person in Singapore. So in person, I've got Sarah Green on my left here. Sarah is the Law Commissioner for Commercial and Common Law for England and Wales. Sarah is currently evaluating the need for law reform in relation to smart contracts, electronic trade documents and digital assets. I've got on my right Mirka, who is the head of working capital and trade products at NatWest. Welcome, Mirka. To her right, we've got Sudhir Dole. Sudhir is the Chief Executive Officer of the Trade Information Network. Sudhir has a 29-year career as a banker and working across a number of international banks for the past 27 years and 2 years at TIN, right? Okay, Sudhir. And then on the far left here, we have Richard from Finion Exchange. He's the head of institutional sales. Richard has a distinguished career at HSBC before joining the Crown Agents Bank as CEO, which he subsequently sold in 2017, and has been leading, advising, and investing in startups since then, including Finion Exchange, where he's currently based, leading the FI relationships. And in Singapore, on the screen, is Louise Heller-Digby from Swift. She's the head of trade strategy at Swift, and I think previously that was at Barclays. So maybe I can start with you, Louise, and ask you, in your role at Swift as the head of trade strategy, you have a good overview in terms of what's happening globally around the trade digitization journey. Maybe you can give us a quick summary of what's happening there.
Sure. Thank you, Michael, and thank you to the panel and to GTR for hosting this today. So look, from a Swift perspective, we literally see hundreds of platforms, ecosystems, frameworks, and applications ultimately targeting the automation and digitization of trade/commerce flows. You know, they all seek to target different components of that, but broadly speaking, we're looking at the automation and the digitization of trade and commerce flows. And I used to talk about, we're tracking 55. There are now hundreds. And we're seeing those being driven not only by fintechs, but also by financial institutions and increasingly so by governments. At Swift, on behalf of the community, we facilitate about $2 trillion in documentary trade. And whilst overall trade was down, as one would expect, in 2020, the digital trade channel actually grew by over 70%. So it significantly outperformed documentary trade volumes overall. And that was from both a volume and a value perspective, I should add. And I say this because it's indicative of a wider theme. We're seeing this domino effect of disruption. So the economic disruption brought on by the pandemic, and even before the pandemic by geopolitics, is driving supply chain disruptions and supply chain resiliency. That's driving the digital agenda, and that in turn is driving this reevaluation of business and of operating models. The pandemic we see as a catalyst for trade digitization. It really exacerbated the payment frictions, in particular, unearthed frauds that we're all familiar with, and really motivated even regulators to come out and call for a move away from paper. It's forcing supply chain executives to make supply chain resiliency a #1 priority. There was a wonderful McKinsey survey that ranked 93% of supply chain executives were looking at how they build resiliency into their operations, which of course leans on the digitization agenda. And we're also seeing a consumer shift to digital, so it's right across the spectrum. In Q1 2020, Amazon was recording revenues of around $33 million per hour, right? So the pandemic has certainly been a huge, compelling event for trade digitization, from consumer through to SME, all the way through to banks and to government. And of course, there's a direct correlation between trade, between GDP and employment. So we're increasingly seeing governments stepping in to see how they can play that enabling role. But we still have challenges to work through. So the statistics don't lie, right? The Digital Container Shipping Association tells us that 0.1% of bills of lading have been digitised. There was a wonderful study done in the UK by the ICC and the banks that tells us that it's still taking 5 to 9 weeks for SMEs in particular to organise letters of credit. And we still see more and more digital islands popping up on the horizon without due consideration for interoperability. I think when we think about what's needed, and I don't want to steal Professor Sarah Green's thunder, but legislative reform is going to be a huge catalyst for trade digitisation from our perspective. And we've been really enthused to see the progress that's been made in that space. At CyBOF last year, we had the United Nations Commission for International Trade Law talk about Melita, this model law for electronic trade, electronic transferable records. And in the 6 months that followed, we've seen the world's largest trade agreement, the RCEP, mention legislative reform to enable digitisation. We've seen the G7 come out and talk about trade digitisation and commit to legislative reform. We've seen Abu Dhabi change its laws, we've seen Singapore change its laws, and we've seen some fantastic progress from Sarah's team that I know she's going to come to shortly. So the pace of legislative reform has been quite phenomenal. We see it as a strategically compelling event, a game changer. I think the next exam question for us, and again I'm looking forward to the panel discussing that today, is how do we commercialise that? And we've seen some glimmers of that with the emergence of initiatives like Trade Trust. It's not a platform, it's a framework for interoperability to help commercialise some of those law changes. But I still think that there's a lot of big challenges that we need to work through as a community. We've got, some emergent new technologies that we also need to work through. We've seen the recent Basel Committee for Banking Supervision paper on the prudential treatment of crypto assets, which is not just restricted to currencies. So we've got that to work through. And we've got a big standards effort that we need to work through as well. And this is not just data specifications, but standards for identity, standards for security protocols, for APIs. And it's been fantastic to see in the last year the advent of the ICC's Digital Standards Initiative, really trying to bring together the physical and financial supply chains to achieve that. So if I had to summarise it, Michael, I'd said that there's been a series of compelling events that lead us to believe that, now is the time to digitise trade. We've had the pandemic, we've got this fantastic legislative reform that's coming through. So we've got some real compelling events that serve as wonderful catalysts, but we have some really difficult questions to answer as a community to make this a reality.
Thanks, Louise. That's a great summary, and wonderful to hear paperless trade or digital trade being put onto the G7 agenda down in Cornwall the other week. I guess it sort of naturally leads me to ask Sarah a question, which is, so it looks like Abu Dhabi's gone, Singapore is gone, I heard Bahrain as well has gone in terms of changing laws. Well, what's happening in the UK doesn't seem like making a lot of progress.
We are, so Louise has mentioned Melita, so the model law on electronic trade documents. And that is a international, as the name suggests, model, which is what has been adopted to a greater or lesser extent in the jurisdictions that you mention. And we're working on that now. So at the Law Commission of England and Wales, we currently have a draft bill and a consultation paper, and that consultation period is open at the moment. It can be accessed on our website. I'm saying this because anyone in the audience has any view on what we have done, then we do want to hear from you. It is a highly consultative process. We are genuinely interested in the views of anybody who feels they have an interest in these reforms or proposed reforms. So what we have done is we have adopted a similar approach really to the one that's in Melita, but we have tailored it to the law of England and Wales because there are certain differences, as you might imagine, between jurisdictions. And that's why it is not quite as simple as it sounds. So I quite often get asked, well, why can't you just write a law that says actually electronic trade documents can work in the same way as paper documents? But it's very difficult to do that without breaking other things in the legal system, and obviously we don't want to do that. So what we have done is made proposals for giving electronic trade documents exactly the same functionality in the law as paper documents have. And at the moment, and I think this is a real surprise to lots of people, at the moment, that just is not the case. So you cannot just, and this explains Louise's statistics, one of the statistics that Louise referred to, which was that really minuscule take-up of electronic trade documentation. But that's not surprising to me, because why would you pour resources into constructing these systems, constructing these platforms, if you know that they're not going to have the same legal effect as paper documents? And it feels very strange to be saying this in 2021, but at the moment, the law of England and Wales just simply doesn't recognise those documents as having the same legal effect. And we're trying to change that. We're trying to get rid of the legal blocker. I'm not going to go into the down the rabbit hole of exactly what those legal changes are. In essence, it's about intangibility. And at the moment, English law doesn't treat intangible things, and it sees electronic trade documents as intangible things. Not everybody might agree with that, but that's how they are seen. And so they cannot be held and possessed in the same way as paper. And because they can't be held and possessed in the same way as paper, at the moment, they don't have that legal effect. So we're trying to change that. We're trying to say if electronic documents, you'll see in the proposals and the consultation paper, if electronic documents exhibit certain characteristics, they can be held, they can be possessed, and they therefore can transfer title in the way that paper documents do. So, as I said, the consultation period is open until the end of July. We will then review those proposals in the light of the consultation responses we have received. So I'm giving you a time frame because we are behind further the jurisdictions.
I was going to ask you how long it's going to take.
Sure.
So that legal reform doesn't usually take a short period of time.
It never takes a short period of time. I think that's fair to say. But of course, what we want to do is we want to make sure we get it right, because we don't want to have to go through another really long process in a few years' time. So at the end of this consultation, we then analyse the consultation responses. We then put together, so that might mean changing the draft bill. We will then write a report, a final report, which we submit to government, and then it's up to government to decide whether to adopt those proposals or not. That is not going to happen before spring 2022. So that's the time frame that we currently have in mind.
And how long do people have to come back on consultation? So if they come to your website, what's the date that says they need to respond by?
30th of July.
30th of July. Okay,
Yeah.
so at least another month.
Yes.
To come back. Okay,
Yes.
That's great. That's great. So it sounds like the UK is moving quite rapidly for legal reform to come to a situation where electronic documents are going to be acceptable under law.
Yeah, absolutely. This project has been fast-tracked, so it would normally take quite a lot longer than this. There are some reforms that are done in a similar way, which take up to 3 years. But because this is obviously very time-sensitive, and everybody realises it's time-sensitive, and as you pointed out, and as Louise pointed out, other jurisdictions are already doing it, then we have made it as quick as we possibly can.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. So I guess the question that sort of naturally follows is, we're going to have legal reform in the UK by sometime next year, where electronic documents are going to be treated in the same way as paper is currently treated.
We hope so.
We hope so. And if that happens, then how do you commercialize against that? Which I think is the point that Louise you made. What's next? How does that actually then translate into companies, SMEs, corporates, banks actually dealing in digital documents as opposed to dealing with paper? So maybe Mirka, I can ask you kind of, how do you obviously you must be excited by what's happening.
Absolutely excited, and we are a big part of that reform as well, as you know. So I'm definitely driving it. I have this standing joke about trade that our innovation never moved from clay tablets to paper, and we're just stuck on paper, and we're still stuck on paper. But I think we need to change the mindset. because participating in lots of those consultation groups that talk about digitizing trade documents, we as the players in that ecosystem are still thinking paper. And it's shocking. So we need to really challenge ourselves. So first and foremost is change of the mindset and really recognizing that electronic asset and document is really on a par with documents. So that's first and foremost. Trade is complex and you need to have big movers to start driving the agenda. But absolutely, you also have to think about all the other participants within that trade cycle. And there is many. Custom officials, port authorities, haulage companies, it's endless, isn't it? And I think technology is probably the only way to start putting them all together and creating something more seamless than what we currently have.
So I guess the question is, it is complex. I think trade is complex. Are we going to wait for the legal reform, or is stuff happening today?
So stuff has to be happening today, and stuff is happening today. But I think, as Louis said, it's happening in small bits, and it's very fragmented.
Yeah.
But being able to respond to it quickly, I think, is the first step forward. And pandemic definitely accelerated that. From NatWest perspective, we had a fantastic solution that we implemented pretty much second month into the pandemic from Swift, which allowed us the electronic document presentation just between the banks.
Yeah.
As you can see, it's tiny. It's tiny because it's just between the banks we were able to implement it straight away, and it definitely speed up the process when we could not afford for any physical document presentation, and a fantastic solution from Swift. But the challenge for us is, how do we avoid the rubber band syndrome? Because we get into it, we like it, suddenly something is possible, and very often we go back to our old ways. So it's definitely happening in snippets, but it's nothing that yet underpins the entire ecosystem and all the lawmakers. And we're doing a lot of pilots with our customers, and they love it. But when you think about various jurisdictions, you might be in a jurisdiction that is adopting those rules, but trading with jurisdiction that doesn't. And say, we really love it, it's superb, it allows us to respond fast, but we don't have the legal equivalent in our country. So I think it has to move with pace. We can't wait for legal reform. We need to get ready to it, because technology will require, as Sarah likely pointed, ability to welcome it into your organization. Nothing is really that seamless these days.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think the ability to learn about the best ways of deploying new solutions has to start now.
Okay.
This is a time to do our homework, and that applies to banks, corporates, SMEs, everybody, and to really welcome that agenda.
I think it's a good opportunity to bring Sudhir in, because Sudhir, you've been working on Trade Information Network for probably 2 years now. And I saw a first live transaction. So maybe you can talk a little bit about sort of how you're digitizing the invoice and purchase order cycle.
Thanks, Michael. And I completely endorse what you said just now, that the financial institutions have to take a lead. And it's great to see that the government and the legal reforms that are taking place. But really, we as financial institutions need to take a lead and make an impact on the market. And it's something like, you can say, the cars have to be built first and the roads will get built later. Right? So I would use that analogy. And if you look at what we have done in Trade Information Network, is that at the end of the day, we are a company which has been formed by 6 of the largest trade banks in the world, but not for themselves. It's been industry utility, which we have created. So it's for the entire financial community. That's our model. And we are very simply put an information registry. And as Michael was saying, the key point here, especially in open account trade, is that buyers and suppliers should be able to exchange information and data in a simple, secure, and transparent way. And with each other, and then of course with their banks. And that's what our platform aims at. And if I talk about our recent use case, which is of Deutsche Bank, has demonstrated that very well with Roche as their customer, and has enabled financing for the supplier of Roche, thanks to our platform, at the pre-shipment stage of financing. So it clearly shows that if the parties collaborate, which is the buyer, the supplier, as well as the banker, then it's possible to, in fact, ensure that financing reaches the early stages of financing, which is where it's more difficult, and especially for the SME segment, which again is obviously a segment which has been severely impacted. And Louis spoke about resilience. So I think building resilience in the supply chain has become so critical. And with this kind of digitization efforts which we have done, we will build further resilience in the supply chains of our large customers.
That's really interesting to see. I mean, Richard, you're involved in many projects, but Finian for me is a project that is around enabling sort of receivables to be sold and purchased in a more seamless way. How is the law reforms going to help your business?
Well, I think the law reform is fundamental to everything. Part of the thing we're debating here is how the UK can take a leadership position in digitalisation, and one of our key strengths in the UK is the rule of law. I mean, it's trusted globally, and it's one of our key assets. And it's wonderful to see people working on what we need to do. For Finion, what I like about it, and I love what Tin are doing as well, because it comes from a client perspective. You know, it's quite easy to sit here saying, looking from the top down, we should do this, or a financial institution should do that. But if we focus on the customer who's actually importing and exporting and trading really and what they need, I mean, that's what you're doing at Tin, that's what NatWest is trying to do, and that's where you're trying to reform the law. But for us at Finion, we just have figured out where we sit in that value chain, which is putting borrowers and lenders together in a more efficient way. But then we step back, we don't try to control the transaction, we don't try to do what you're doing, we just try to say, there's some friction here. You know, you've got exporters who are lacking in finance because of changes in Basel, because of different risk appetites of banks. I mean, look what happened to supply chains with the global pandemic. You know, and actually what fintechs do is, and the UK fintech environment is wonderful, it's incredibly dynamic. And that's largely driven by the legislation, actually. So it's just a great breeding ground for focusing on clients and getting things done. And some of those things then roll up into things that can be adopted by the big institutions and backed by the law. So that's kind of a broad laying out of, you know, Finion's just one little bit of that, but I see it across the fintech spaces, using technology, digitization to focus on solving customer problems. And then you have to take a step back, a bit like perhaps you're doing at Swift, and say, right, what is going to work here? And it is agglomerations of big financial institutions getting their head around solving the problem for customers.
And I think that's a really good point around solving problems for customers, because you know, when I'm looking at some of the Q&A that's coming in, you know, I think that the top one over there, which is really around solving practical issues, and it is about solving challenges for exporters on paperwork, customs processes, official documentation, etc. So it's great to have the legal reform that backs it, but what else is kind of being done? And I think the second question I think is quite well related, which is, you know, how is that consultation between government going beyond just the legal reform, and is there other discussions that are kind of going on? So I don't know if someone wants to take that question.
It's a good one, because it's asking about how the governments work together. And we know that governments don't necessarily have a great track record of working together. And you do need to have someone that acts as a conduit. And I do believe that International Chamber of Commerce has been and is that conduit for a while now. And I think they are perfectly positioned to lobby, to intervene, but also to engage in dialogue with governments around the world. And I think we have to recognize that without someone that is helping to facilitate that dialogue between governments, it's not possible. And I think ICC is trying really hard to fill this space, for sure. But government is always tricky. It's challenging. Why? Because governments come with cycles of, let's say, 4, 8, lucky 12 years, but it doesn't matter. It needs longevity. And that longevity has to be derived from something different than a political agenda. It has to be totally apolitical. It has to be really set up with future goals, which we're talking decades in the future. So I think ICC probably is the great.
Actually, just to weave that back into the first question, if I may, because we're all trying to solve the same problem here. But actually, a political event, Brexit, has created the issues being raised in the first question.
Made it worse, hasn't it?
Yeah, but actually, if you look at digitization and a fintech response, I mean, there's a wonderful company called Exabler, which I know the founders of very well, who are exactly now signing big contracts with big importers and exporters in the UK because of the issues with customs and documentation processes. And when that innovation gets adopted in response to a political situation, then that innovation works in practice. So I think there's probably 5 or 10 companies trying to solve that same problem and jockey for position within that space, right? It's incredible what is going on, and sometimes we don't recognize that. And it's such a strength of our marketplace here. So I'm very positive about the future, but seeing the wood for the trees sometimes is quite hard.
Louise, do you have a perspective?
I think that's a great point, seeing the wood for the trees. I think, and your point, Michael, around are we going to sit and wait for global legislative reform? I don't think we can. I think we need to have both short and long-term strategies here. Our short-term strategy was repurposing an existing solution towards the needs of the trade community at the height of the pandemic to say, whether you're a bank or a Swift connected corporate, you can move documents across Swift free in a safe, secure and scalable manner. But we know more longer term, once the legislative reforms in place, that it's going to have additional complexities that we need to solve for in terms of control and singularity and title transfer. And so I think, the wood for the trees is a really good analogy for the trade digitisation space, because you do need this kind of macro-micro perspective to navigate through it. And as some of the panellists have said, at all times, we need to be mindful of the customers at the heart of that. So I'd agree with some of the panellists that macro-micro perspective is really important at the moment.
Cool. Thanks, Louise. Sudhir, you wanted to jump in on that?
Yes, on the point about consultation between governments, I definitely see a lot of consultation between the central banks. And and that has, I think, definitely had a positive impact. And if I look at some of the ideas talking about even the receivable space, right? There were receivable exchanges in the US, and then you see, for example, if I can look at India, receivables platforms were set up. So definitely there is a cross-fertilization of ideas which is happening. I don't know to what extent it's very well coordinated, but there is definitely cross-fertilization of ideas. There are the colleges which the central banks hold with each other nowadays, the last 5-6 years. So definitely, I think those things help.
And also they're leading on some of the newest technologies, like digital assets, crypto assets. It's the central banks that are actually really saying, no, we have a policy for it. We recognize its place. And that makes it even more exciting, I think, for the future.
Yeah, I mean, I've obviously spent a lot of time with central banks around the world, and it is a very functional ecosystem, and we forget that sometimes. I mean, I've been particularly involved around the de-risking debate, especially with African banks, and I'm still very actively involved in that. But there is an alignment of values there, and there's an alignment of needs, which is around keeping everybody safe and making sure financial institutions, deposit holders, their deposits are protected. That's what central banks do. In the trade space, we've also got shared values globally, which Swift represents, quite frankly, and so do organisations like TIN. And the shared values are we all need to trade successfully with each other, which is kind of the foundation of the way our world works and creates value. So I do believe there is a possibility there to leverage the central bank networks and trade policy strategists, trade negotiators, organisations like Swift, the sort of legal setup. There can be a vision, I think, for the UK in particular to lead on this because of its unique position in the world. And that's not because I can see Parliament out of the window at this building and we're all blowing smoke. Actually, I think it's the other way around. Actually, the UK needs to lead this. Certainly from an African perspective, the UK is a trusted jurisdiction. Whether it always justifies that trust, we can have a different debate, but it really genuinely is. And the rule of law, our seat in democracy, gives us almost and a lack of geopolitical, negotiating positions like China or the States. We are uniquely positioned to actually try and do the right thing here in the UK.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. But it also explains, I think, why we've maybe not been as quick as some other jurisdictions, because Richard's absolutely right. We are a very trusted jurisdiction, and lots of parties, wherever they're based in the world, choose to have their transactions governed by English law, which is fantastic, and does, I think, mean that we have a responsibility to make sure that we keep up with what commercial parties want and expect. and those technologies. But it also, one of the reasons that English, particularly commercial law, is so valued is that it's been so it provides certainty and it provides confidence, and those rules don't, change with the wind. Yeah. So we have to get the balance right, because this is a change that I think we definitely need to do, and it's long overdue. But we also have to bear in mind that one of the things that English law is valued for is its solidity, and people depend on it because they know what to expect. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword in that way, but I completely agree with you. Now is more than the time to change, I think. So hopefully that's what will happen.
Okay, no, I think that's a really good point. I guess one of the debates that's been happening is this sort of digital island that I think was raised around, and are we going to end up with digital islands actually becoming more, like increasing the number of digital islands and spreading, or are we going to actually see some of these digital islands start to connect together? And I think there's a question there on the bottom already that says I'm not sure if they're trying to set themselves up as the answer to this question, but the big challenge for us is how do we create an open system for all, that we get agreement onto technology, law and standards, and not an easy ask. Who on the panel thinks should lead this effort, if anyone? Or is it a collaborative effort? Is it a movement? How is this going to work? How do we start to connect things together?
I think it's already a collaborative effort. I mean, when I think about other Law Commission projects, there has been a natural move with this one in a way that there hasn't been with lots of the other things we've looked at, whereby everybody recognises that it can't really happen unilaterally, and that it's inauthentic to pretend that we can do this on our own and ignore what everybody else is doing, because of course by definition what we're talking about are global issues and global assets and global transactions. And so whilst I said at the very beginning that the Law Commission is tailoring the model law on electronic transferable records to English law, we are doing that alongside sitting on other national and international bodies who are obviously all grappling with the same issues. They have slightly different legal systems, of course, but they've all got the same problems and the same obstacles. And so we sit and we listen to each other, and we know what other jurisdictions are doing. And that is quite unusual in the law reform space, but I think it's really, really important, and it's really encouraging. And it's surprising to me, actually, how much of a consensus there is on a lot of these issues. So I don't think we're a million miles away on that. As to who should lead it, I'm going to leave that to someone else.
I'm a big fan of what you're saying, and I do think that just the UK can and should have the confidence to look to take a leadership position. And there's lots of people in the industry who need to be involved in that. And it is, I hate to say it, quite got to be driven by a political vision as well, which the politicians need to have. And I know we're working on that collectively.
Well, the G7 helps, right? It's set on the agenda, and government departments tend to follow what the G7.
What I think, obviously the COVID pandemic's been terrible for most people on the world, but sometimes you need a good crisis. In the same way, we're now using Zoom. I remember watching Tomorrow's World, if anybody's old enough to remember that, 20 years ago, when they showed us digital phones will come one day. And then do you remember Google came and you could FaceTime? Nobody really did it, did they? And then a pandemic, I live on Zoom now. Mm-hmm. Do I work at home? No, I live at work. So that change in behaviour has to be driven sometimes by somebody to get mass adoption, that tipping point, and that's what's happened. And that connects the sort of that's the final question you just asked, Michael, about what's the big challenge. Well, we will all collaborate against something. That's whole shock to supply chains, which we're talking about today, the solution is in digitisation, and it is in collaboration now that the shock has happened, because the people running these supply chains have realised how broken they are and how vulnerable they are. And then we will all group together around solving that. Coming back to, if I may, to the question on SMEs, because I just leave you to do that, Michael. I'd love to connect that up.
I want to pick it up. Yeah. Does anyone make a point on this effort? Go on.
Yeah, Michael. So I think again, I would say that within certain countries, I observe that there has been certain jurisdiction whereby the existing platforms can, in a way, even without API, register certain information and share that information. So I see that, but clearly on a global scale, it's still progress to be made. And from our perspective, when we looked at this issue, one of our key aims is to be that connector, because very simply we are, as I said, we are led by 6 of the largest trade banks in the world. So to be the digital connector, whereby we can connect to these various islands, is a definite aim for us. And it comes from the fact that we are an industry utility. So that, and simply put, an information registry. So because we are an information registry and we don't do, for example, financing on our platform, the various financing platforms can all collaborate with us. We don't see them as competition. They should not see us as competition. So that's where I feel by creating a global information registry, we definitely can be that kind of a connection. And then people don't have to build multiple pipes, which is what is happening today, because both corporates as well as banks are building multiple pipes to connect to each other. They all just need to connect to us, and then we connect to everyone. So, and obviously we have built our APIs and interoperability, keeping in mind that.
But I think we have to be honest that there will never be a global solution for something.
I think that's
And I think we should be actually happy, and bear with me, that we do have those digital islands. Why? Because that is a very good symptom of where we're going in our mindset. It's any single digitization. Look at the mobile phones. Every single thing started in digital islands and multiple technologies underpinning it until you get to period of on consolidation side. So I think the more, the better at this stage, because it shows we actually are moving in the right direction. But the consolidation will happen naturally. And technology is there to enable it. So I don't think anyone needs to necessarily get a big consensus. Are we going to go with this technology or that technology? The world doesn't work like that. It's being
I love that
open-minded.
perspective. I really love that perspective.
Yeah.
Go on, Louise.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the devil's in the detail of how you define a digital island, right? And if we go back to the earlier point, if you put yourself in the shoes of an importer or exporter who's managing, 7 different logons with 7 different passwords and 7 different security protocols and different standards, that's a nightmare for them, right? And that's how I look at digital islands. And on one hand, I agree with what you're saying, right? Digital islands are symptomatic of innovation and of progress and trial and error fundamentally, right, which is a good thing. But at the same time, when we're trying to solve things like fraud, when we're trying to ensure that global commerce flows, I do get concerned about data being locked in individual digital islands with all the best intentions. But that does concern us, because we all know that trade by its very nature is cross-border, right? These things don't happen in isolated closed loops. And so I think we need to be mindful of that. And we can vote with our feet, right? As banks, as corporates, as fintechs selling our solutions, we're able to vote with our feet and follow those solutions and opportunities that are adopting a more open, interoperable approach. Because if we think through the consequences of that, it's all very well to go through the R&D stage, but when it comes to the return on strategic investment, if the data is locked down, if it's restricted to one jurisdiction, or if it's restricted to one particular platform, then it's never going to scale. So I agree that it's a good thing to see this explosion in wonderful innovation. And at Swift, we look at it and say, we are open to collaborating with multiple different partners. And what we aim to bring to that scenario is standards, but also standardization of identity, standardization of API protocols, and allowing the community to start to consume some of these new value-added services through the Swift environment, so that they do get some degree of global standardization. Because I do think we need to be mindful of some of the risks of digital islands, especially when it comes to facilitating the smooth flow of global commerce for corporates, or when it comes to trying to mitigate against things like fraud.
I just can see someone's challenging that as
well.
well.
I think it's great. I think the good thing about this is there's definitely disagreement and non-consensus.
I think it's a question of terminology, because what we say, we absolutely need standards, but we also have to be honest with each other. No customers from the entire world will access one platform. No customers from the entire world will subscribe to one data depository. So what we're talking about when we talk about different solutions, different inroads, those digital islands do play part. But I agree with Louise, what has to be underneath all of it is standards. And those standards have to be absolutely acceptable globally. So I think that's just the terminology point.
And there are different legal requirements, and there are always going to be different legal requirements across the world anyway. So that
Absolutely.
will, yeah.
So it's always going to be local, but connected potentially, right? And I think that's really interesting that we've definitely got non-consistent. And I want to bring this back. So apologies. I want to bring this back, and it's great that we're actually having a conversation, which I've missed, versus the sort of speeches on different Zoom calls. But I think one of we forget the demand side of the equation, right? And I think there's a great question here, which is sort of what sort of pushback is there from the SME market that not all companies wish or need to be digitized? Is there enough incentive for companies to digitize, and could it necessarily work for the really small companies? So, it's great we're talking about connecting digital islands and legal frameworks at the end of the day, but the small trader who's got 5 trades a year, does it matter for them?
So it's a great question, and it's
Brilliant
something
question.
I've been involved in for a long time, and I think we all have. When you say digitisation, there's a lot of new companies being formed which are what we call digital first, which means they're formed around not the old way of doing things, although they're still filling the same place in the value chain. So for an existing business, some will have to go through, frankly, a process of fundamental digitisation, and including the banks, by the way, which aren't, but not even close to that, and they have a really set of strategic challenges. It's much easier, as I'm doing, setting up a new digital bank to do that, because uninventing things. I always make the joke, do you ask a pilot who's in your, if you're an airline, do you ask a pilot what new plane you need? Well, he's not going to tell you what new plane you need because he can't fly it. So banks tend to ask their IT department what they should do, and there's no fundamental buy-in from the IT department to put themselves out of work. I can promise you that. Coming back to the SME market, though, the truth is some companies are going to have to digitise themselves and bite the bullet. A lot need to look at it differently. They need to embrace digitisation. We have a lot of traders on Finion who have that same fundamental question. They don't have to digitise themselves. They can use us as a digital service to find a lender, and we help them on the digital journey of presenting the necessary documents, KYC, AML, lending proposal to the funder in a consistent way using digital technology and digital AML, KYC, so that the funder just gets a digitised approach for them. So I think there's lots of ways for SMEs to engage in adopting digitalisation, if I can say that right, without having to think, how do I digitise myself? And so I depends, you've got to, as an SME, look at it and say, what are my standard business questions, what are my competitors doing, what's the market doing? I find it hard to think you're going to have a successful company without any digitisation, if I'm honest. So it comes on to who can help. All the banks are trying to help. There's a lot of money being spent by government trying to help.
Yep.
And you just need to go online,
Sudhi, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think incentivization for the SMEs would come twofold. One is, of course, their own internal processes and efficiencies and so on. But I think the point you made, right, at the end of the day, the incentivization comes also if they are able to become more resilient thanks to the digitization. Are they able to get more access to finance? Then they would be sufficiently incentivized. And is the cost of funding coming down? That's another source of incentivization. So platforms, whether it's ours or others, who are able to get SMEs to get these benefits will definitely add value to the SMEs.
So if you solve a problem for them,
absolutely,
then they're going to incentivize.
I also think they're a bit sometimes overwhelmed with the amount of digitization that's happening. But having been sitting in front of the customers, I also, sometimes, to Richard's point, it's very humbling when you get in front of the customer. And I do try my best to get in front of them as often as I possibly can. And frankly, I feel the odd one out as a banker. They're far more digitized than the banks are. So when there is a pushback from SMEs, and we as a bank, of course, recognize that, but I think they do. But there is the element of being overwhelmed and where you invest the money. I think that is the critical challenge when it's the question about the challenge. There is so many ways that SMEs can digitize and be more efficient, but they're still SMEs, and they need to decide where do they prioritize where do they make that call? And that's not easy. And this is where we do have to help. This is where we need to educate and really start thinking about the big impact areas.
Yeah. Cool.
Just quickly on that, just from the legal reform point of view, the proposals that we've made are in no way mandatory. So what we're interested in is harmonising different approaches so that if people still want to use paper documents, they're not going to lose their functionality and they're not going to lose their validity. So until, I suspect what I thought would happen is that larger organisations would have the resources to develop the systems, to develop interoperability, and then obviously, as you said, that the price will then fall and it can be adopted more widely. So certainly, as far as the law is concerned, there is going to be no mandate to shift.
Okay, cool. I'm just conscious, I think we're coming up to the last 5 minutes of the session. And I wanted to kind of bring it back to the UK and the leadership role. So perhaps maybe ask each of you to have a last comment before we close out. And I'll start with Louise in Singapore. So from your perspective, how do you see the UK sitting in Singapore and looking at the UK in terms of where it's positioned right now and what position what it can play going forward?
I think it's been fantastic to see the progress that's been driven over the last 6 or 7 months, and as many of the panellists have alluded, a change in English law will have ramifications beyond UK shores, which is hugely exciting for the trade digitisation effort. I think it's then upon all of us to think about what are the next steps in that journey? How do we operationalise this? How do we implement that? Those are going to be very big and broad conversations across our organisations. It's not just about the technology, it's risk and control dynamics and so on. So I think it's fantastic to see the progress that's been made by Professor Green's team. Very excited to see more into next year. And I think there's a call to action to the community to go away and think about how we're going to operationalise that.
I think the UK, as we said before, is in a leadership position already, both in regulatory and law and digitisation. At Finian, we're a global finance marketplace, but we've kind of migrated everything, even though we're set up in Luxembourg, to the UK because it's the global centre of finance. We sometimes don't see that in everything we do here, or sometimes we overemphasise it. So I just want to see, almost like from a legislative perspective, I think it's got to be driven partly by regulators, it's got to be driven by government, it's got to be driven by the sort of initiatives you're leading. And we need to sit down and say, what is this system? Let's look at it as a system and say, where are the bits broken? The fintech space goes to the bits that are broken and tries to solve them, but with no great plan. So most of it doesn't work, quite frankly. If we could have some sort of plan along the lines of what Tin's doing, along the lines of the banks collaborating with the regulators, with the legal profession, there's some things there that we need to fix, like customs. We're going to talk about customs. Brexit, we've got a really bad customs system in the UK that stops an awful lot of stuff. Right? So that sort of thing, that's broken as well as the law. So what is it we need to fix? Let's just go fix it, and then we'll be the leaders.
Celine?
So I think the UK definitely sets the gold standards for many things. And clearly from a regulatory perspective, it's always taken a lead, others have followed. From English law, I think the point you made, definitely there is the value that brings, the English courts. There's a huge amount of respect globally. So the UK should definitely play a leadership role in this whole development. And I also feel that some of this will all happen together. Whether it's the digital islands, whether it's kind of an unregulated, it's not the Wild West. I think there is some coordination, there is some cooperation and collaboration which is happening already. And these streams whereby over a period of time they dovetail into each other, the unregulated and the regulated, and over a period of time will happen. But we should just enjoy the journey as it happens. That's the way I see it.
I like that a lot. I think we collectively need to challenge ourselves in terms of our mindset, because we can't move forward if we're still in a paper era and we still think along these lines. English law is fantastic. And I think it can push us towards the next milestone on the journey. But also from a company's perspective, from business's perspective, what I would say, be inquisitive, try to understand where your goods coming from and where you sell, because that probably will drive the best prioritization calls you can make on your digitization strategy.
So I'm just going to reiterate my call to responses to the consultation, really, because I think what everybody has said about English law is absolutely true. But what we are not at the Law Commission is some sort of top-down organisation that is going to impose rules on the users of that law if they're not going to work. So we really do want to know. We want to connect up the operational, the technological, with the laws that will govern them. We're not in the business of writing these lovely elegant provisions if they don't work. So I would just finish off, I think, by saying, please, if you do have any views on our proposals, we want your honest opinions. We want to get it right.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you, everybody. I think what it reminds me of is this great YouTube video, and I was just visualizing it when Sadia was speaking with it of leadership, and it's about dancing. So if you've seen it, right?
Yeah,
dancing
on his own.
The first crazy to get up and start dancing is that leadership, but actually it's the second person that gets up there and brings their friends with them that actually then gets the dance party really going. So it does sound like the UK is well on the way to getting that dance party going. So I'm really looking forward to it. And thank you very much, everybody.